How can we be confident that we have the right books in the New Testament? Let's talk about that. Hello, welcome to Clarity and Brevity. We have a New Testament that gives us a record of God's redemption, and that points us to what Christ has done and its implications. But you might wonder, why do we have confidence that we have the right books? Maybe you've even heard that the New Testament was based on a vote. Well, that's not exactly the best way to think about it. You see, the New Testament emerged quite naturally and uniformly in the history of the church. And for most of the books of the New Testament, there was basically no debate on it. You can see this, for example, by the middle of the 2nd century. So within 100 years or so, maybe less, of the Gospels being written, we have evidence for 4 Gospels, the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, being copied as a unit and circulating as a unit. We also have evidence early on that Paul's letters were copied and circulated as a unit. And you can see this not only in our manuscripts, for example, Papyrus 46, which is our earliest edition of Paul's letters, but you can also see this in the way that the early church fathers, and I'm talking very early in the 2nd century, and they're already using Paul's letters as authoritative. You could look, for example, at the Epistle of Polycarp, and in Polycarp's letter, you can see how often he's referring to New Testament writings as authoritative. In fact, what you have in the early church is, for a doctrine, I'm talking post-New Testament now, for a doctrine to be authoritative, the church fathers knew it had to be scriptural. And further, if you look at the way that people like Ignatius of Antioch looked at the apostles, they viewed them as highly esteemed. They deferred to the apostles. You can see the same thing in other church fathers as well. So the early Christian writers show us that they are viewing the New Testament writings as special and as authoritative because they are apostolic. So the actual authorship of these letters and these books in the early church is quite important, given that the apostles are chosen by Christ and are foundational, and their writings are foundational for the church today. And you can, just to see that, look at Ephesians 2:20, for example. And so if you wonder how close was the vote, did they decide these based on a vote? That's really not the best way to think about it. If you actually read widely in the early church, what you find is these letters, there were some questions about some, but these letters and Gospels arose quite naturally in the context of the early church, and only rarely did debates arise. So we're not dealing here with an official top-down decision that dictated what the books were in the New Testament canon. What you're dealing with, though, is a more grassroots level. That is, there's no top-down authority structure that chose the books of the New Testament. Early Christianity was not that organized. You see some variation, but I would summarize that of the 27 books, there was no debate really, no substantial debate about at least 22 of them, and maybe more. And what you see is a widespread consensus that these are the books that the Holy Spirit has inspired. We talk about scriptures in theological terms as self-attesting. That is, the scriptures attest their own authority at root, and the church recognizes and responds to that. And so one of the principles is the origin of the New Testament canon is not the same thing as its recognition by the church. The New Testament documents are authoritative when they're written, when they're given by the Holy Spirit. But it does take time for the church to recognize these letters and these Gospels and so forth. And so the New Testament canon did not originate from church councils, but from widespread agreement in the churches. Now, just to summarize this, if we were to talk about what are those characteristics, sometimes they're called criteria of canonicity, but I suggest maybe a better term is characteristics of canonicity. They were apostolic, they were ancient, they were orthodox, and they were widely used. Now, they're also inspired, and that underlies them all. But they were apostolic in the sense that they all go back to the age of the apostles. They were written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle. Now, we do have questions, for example, about Hebrews, but this is a very important aspect about the books of the New Testament canon. A book of the New Testament is apostolic in the sense that it comes from an apostle or a close associate of the apostles. And Hebrews, for example, the author there is a close friend of Timothy, You see that in chapter 13, who's a close associate of Paul. Also, these books had to be from the apostolic age. They had to be ancient. They could not be from second generation Christian in terms of chronologically. This is very important because the New Testament writings are authoritative as they go back all the way to the apostolic age. The New Testament writings are also orthodox. They give us right doctrine. And just because something is old doesn't mean it's authoritative. It also has to give us doctrine that accords with the apostolic teaching, or what we might call the rule of faith. Also, these books had to be widely used. They weren't just used in one church or one pocket of the church. And the books that were canonical, they had to be widely used to be canonical. They had to be used by the whole church, you might say. Now, so these four characteristics, apostolicity, antiquity, orthodoxy, and use, point us to four of the characteristics of what makes a canonical book. But it wasn't as though that the early church had a checklist and they were checking these things off. This simply describes from our perspective what the New Testament books are. But also remember, they're inspired by God and they're authoritative. They attest their own authority. So this is just a brief insight into why we can be confident we have the right books. The early church agreed on this. There was very little debate. And where there was debate, eventually a consensus came to the fore. So of course there's more to be said, but I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for watching. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.